All right, this is part two of the online videos for this week, the February 24th. I went ahead and continued working on the user flows before I came back into the video. Be nice if there's a pause feature. Maybe I'll switch over to another screen capture software because it's actually useful to show certain aspects as I'm doing something. So as I'm developing the diagram and kind of thinking through the parts, again, the user inputs, the processing, the cues, the decision points. And the same with coding and just using Unity. It's actually helpful as I'm doing it, but sometimes, you know, and sometimes it's not. I'm sitting there and it's going to take me 20 minutes to figure out piecing together the diagram and another 20 minutes to clean it up or something. And if I went through the whole process, these videos would be a few hours long, and you wouldn't sit through them. So I was kind of showing you how I was initially coming with my ideas for developing these new features for Sprint 2. I was kind of exploring certain aspects, growing some features from Sprint 1, finding some like brand new features to present to the user based on where we've gone and where I would like to go, and also considering your coding experience, what we can get done in the scope of the class. And again, we introduced this idea of this clock, so I am going to continue with this day cycle functionality. Um, anyway, as you can see here, I did end up moving Sprint 2 to the side of Sprint 1 diagrams because as I was aligning stuff, it was like reading above it and trying to align it to the Sprint 1 areas. And I was doing more vertical alignment than horizontal. And so having Sprint 2 underneath Sprint 1 was frustrating for me. It was a frustrating user experience because it kept trying to, as you move, and it's reading the elements above and below it, it's also reading the Sprint 1 elements, trying to align with that. So long story short, I moved Sprint 2 to the side of Sprint 1, and all my alignment situation was much easier to handle with my diagramming. And I was kind of describing that I had a few of these features, and as I was documenting them out, I actually started to draw them and realize that these diagrams were kind of on the simpler side per feature, and it was kind of this bloat um, going on with the diagramming. So I kind of condensed some features that were very similar. And this is why I have, like, for example, this user flow has to do everything with input-based clearing. So now are they left clicking on an object? Are they left clicking on the clear button? And so I was able to add another decision point to this one flow and combine two flows. I didn't have to duplicate out a lot of this. And I was able to clarify, condense, and this process, while it would have been helpful, for you to see in real time as I was doing it. I think it'll be better. We'll go over it in class, and at least I'm kind of showing you the end result where I got my diagrams to. So whereas before I was almost at like 7, maybe even 8 features, a lot of these features were too small and simple, and it made more sense to combine them up. So now I'm at 4 features, and probably by the end of sprint 2, I'm going to aim for 5 features, and that's actually the deliverables I'm going to ask you. So for right now, I have 4 spec'd out, and some of them are pretty well developed at this point, and I went over some of these in last class, the actual code of it. Some of these are new and we have yet to tackle, and that will be in class tomorrow. But let's go over where I'm at. So I have a big square, and squares representing the major functionality areas. And I think I'm going to add another functional area to paint stroke, another user flow to paint stroke functionality as I build this out and use it and see what it feels like, and see if it's a little limiting, if it makes sense to add a little bit more. And the same with the painting environment. This aspect of changing the environment as you're painting. So more of it's sort of relaxed. It's giving the user experience. They're in this virtual environment. It's maybe a sunset. Maybe there's some landscape or something that they can kind of change to suit their experience while they're using the app. So I'll probably add another user flow to each of these functionality areas toward the end of this, or that might go into sprint 3. So there's the beauty of kind of scoping out the project each step as you're moving along. It kind of has this organic growth to it. As you do this more and more, you try to scope out these projects as much as you can at the front end to understand where it's going, how much time you have, how much what these deliverables should be like, what is this application that you wish to deliver at the end of whatever this time frame is and what the features should be. In this case, it's a 3 month college level class. So these rectangles, actually, I was just going to go into the locking feature and I just accidentally moved it, so that's good. So as I click on it, sometimes when you're messing around with your diagram and you want to select multiple parts of it, you don't want to actually select these larger rectangles. They're more for just organization, structural, just mental clarity as you look at it and other people look at it. So if you don't want to move them anymore, you can go edit lock. And then you see as I click on it, it doesn't have those little circles. I can't move it, but you can click on it. So at least it's one less thing that's you're having to navigate through, interact with as you're building out these diagrams. So I mean, you can do this at the end once you scope out your user flows. Just know that it'd be nice to have these bounding areas. So as I move around, I understand that here's sprint 1, here's sprint 2. I can export these out separately when the time comes. And even within the sprints, I'm actually breaking out these areas, so I understand these feature sets that we're developing. And within each set, there's kind of each flow or feature, what have you. So I'll just go back, and that was again edit, lock, unlock, and we've introduced arranging, sending stuff to the front and the back. And you're going to have to get used to these aspects. You can also group stuff. So if I'm really happy with everything within here, I can select it all and group it. And then when you click it, it'll click everything and it'll move it all at once. So sprint 2, I have some features that deal with clearing of painting objects. So paint object clearing functionality. One aspect had to deal with input-based clearing. So in this, we have to queue the user. So we give them directions to understand that they can use left click to clear one-offs, one object at a time, or you could just click the labeled button to clear all. So what happens is there's an input, the user left clicks, and what's happening here, if they're left clicking on an existing slider, or existing collider, I should say, if it is, then yes, we're going to delete that object and end our workflow. Why are we ending here? Because it's a click. It's happening once. They can click again, and they can delete others. Now that I'm walking through this, I actually realized that I did left click and left drag. So I'm probably going to update this later in the week to be more like, are we still dragging? Should we still be deleting stuff and have the feature look more like this? But if we're not clicking on an existing collider, then we do a check. Are we clicking on that clear button? In this workflow, we have two options. Either we're clicking on objects or we're clicking on that clear all button. If we're clicking on the clear all button, then we're going to delete all objects and end. So notice we have like two kind of features wrapped up, and they're so similar. I just did a decision point on them. And now we could just say, well, this is input-based features, input-based clearing features. Now we have timer-based clearing features. So we have a toggle. So we're going to queue the user. Well, we have to give him an understanding of what he's able to do. So we're going to give a toggle, label it to enable and disable the timer. And we're also going to provide a slider, a labeled slider for timer length. How long is the timer when we should destroy an object? So there's a left click event on the slider or on the timer. So if it's on the slider, we're going to change the time clear on future paint objects, the time to clear maybe. Change time to clear. Sounds a little better. My text is a little off. I'm just going to hold down Control and scale out so it's proportional on the center line. If we're clicking on the toggle, then we're going to say, well, is that toggle showing timer enabled? If so, if it's yes, then we're going to disable the timed clear feature on future paint objects, wrap up our workflow. If the timer was not enabled, we're going to enable timed clear on future paint objects. It's also implicitly stated, maybe I'll write it out, that you have to update the toggle as well. But it's basically, is the toggle on? Then basically, if you click it on, you mean you want to turn the toggle off, meaning you want to disable timed options, and vice versa. Either way, we finished that workflow, and now we have a user flow for timer-based clearing and a workflow for input-based clearing. And these both have to deal with clearing functionalities. So as I move over into a separate region, a separate rectangle, we can deal with paint stroke functionalities. So here are modifications. Again, this was separately too. One had to deal with changing the size of each paint object, and one had to deal with the distance between the objects, meaning dealing more with the stroke than the actual paint object. Although at the end result, both are messing around with the scale of a paint object. It's just one is doing it just not even thinking about the paint stroke as an entity. It's just scaling the individual objects up and down. In one, it's actually checking the distance of the previous paint object and trying to scale off that, which we covered in the last class. Either way, we're going to left click. We're going to give an input cue. So we're going to provide a slider to change the size of the object, or the distance between the objects, the scaling of the actually uniform scaling and non-uniform scaling is technically what's going on. But anyway, we left click, and if we do the uniform slider or the non-uniform slider, the individual size are based on the distance of the last object slider. If we just do a general size change, we just do that on our future painted objects, and we wrap up the workflow. Or if we're dragging on the distance slider or the non-uniform scaling, we will change that value between future objects. Again, there's technically a left drag on the slider here, so I might update it to be something like this, although this kind of is a little simpler. So we'll discuss it in class what makes the most sense to you, because at the end result, we're describing features that the developer will then be implementing upon. So we had this painting environment functionality, and right now we're dealing with environmental properties. Right now we're just dealing with the day cycle, because we introduced that concept of a clock and we connected it to the actual system time on our computer. So at start, we update the clock to the current time, the real current time, and we cue the user. Again, we can provide a slider to change this time of day. So in the virtual world, if we wish to change the hour that we're currently representing, we want to move from dawn to midday to dusk to evening. And then say if we wish to reset to the current time, we can provide a button to reset back to the current real time. So either way, we got a left click or some user input. Again, slider. The button's really a click and the slider's really a drag. But did you interact with the slider or the button? If it's the slider, then we are going to change the clock time in the sun location to the slider amount. The slider will be going from 0 to 24, even though in US we're operating on a 12-hour and AM PM. The information that's going to be fed in, it's going to be on a 24-hour clock base. And we're going to left click on the button, then we can show that, well, we should be resetting the clock time and the sun location to the current real time. And then we can end this cycle, or end this user flow. So here we have 4 user flows that have been defined for features. So I want you to come up with your own. I'm going to ask you for 5 features. It's going to be very similar to Sprint 1, meaning give a description of your project. What are you going to do for Sprint 2? What's going to be available to the user? What do you need to build? Then get into more details by showing these user flows. Here I've shown 4. I'm going to ask you for 5. And again, a link or an embedded code to your build. So since I'm wrapping up the diagram, situation here, I'm going to stop this video. And the next video, we're going to continue on into Unity, and we're going to continue on with revamping this user interface and adding and starting to incorporate some of these features discussed in the user flows. And also, I need to update the user interface to show some values. So, for example, what is the current value of blue? Instead of just moving a slider and just having a feel for the visual location of the slider, I'm actually going to show you the number between 0 and 1 or 0 and 100% or whatever I choose to show the user. So I need to update these sliders and continue updating this user interface. We have to be aware now that the user flows are starting to be broken out into major functional areas or major feature sets to kind of organize our thoughts, organize how this app is supposed to function, and organize the information to the user. So our user interface is getting a little clunky, a little overwhelming, a little information overlap. So we should start to break it up into distinct areas. Um, Eventually, maybe we should be hiding parts of it until the user wants to open up and look at more features based on a feature set. In either case, we are going to have to start cleaning up the user interface and really keep minimizing it and shrinking it as we add more information. We're going to move stuff around. Um, and also notice as I open up um, Unity, and as I open up the gaming window, which keeps the aspect ratio, which is this 960 by 600, which is what we're building for the web. But just notice as I open it up, that overlap that was happening, where everything was smushed on top of itself, isn't. So be aware that your game view should be the same kind of size that you're playing on the web. So if you build this and do a local test in Firefox or what have you, make sure that the proportion that's happening on your runtime that is actually in your game view. So we've already dealt with the aspect ratio, but we have to deal with the relative proportional size from our Unity editor game view in relation to our actual build size, the proportion on the web browser, to make sure that all these elements are actually positioned and sized correctly.